The biting November wind whipped around Sarah's ankles as she hurried down the street, her breath misting in the frigid air. Her worn leather handbag swung against her hip, the familiar weight a comforting presence against the chill. She was late, as usual, for her volunteer shift at the soup kitchen, a consequence of her unwavering commitment to visiting her elderly mother each afternoon. But today, something else caught her attention, something that tugged at the compassion that lived deep within her heart. Across the street, huddled beneath the meager shelter of a crumbling brick awning, was a man. He wasn't just any man. He was a picture of despair, a stark contrast to the bustling city life swirling around him. His clothes, threadbare and stained, offered little protection against the elements. His face, etched with lines of hardship and weariness, was partially obscured by a tangled mass of dark hair and a thick, unkempt beard. He clutched a tattered cardboard sign, its message barely legible beneath the grime and rain damage. Sarah paused, her heart aching at the sight of his vulnerability. She'd seen countless people like him on these streets, faces weathered by poverty and misfortune. But something about this man, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his burdens, the way his head hung low, stirred something within her. It was a familiar stirring, the same feeling that always compelled her to offer a helping hand, a kind word, a prayer. She crossed the street, her steps deliberate despite the icy pavement. The closer she got, the more she noticed the details. The raw chapping on his exposed skin, the tremor in his hands as he nervously adjusted his worn-out shoes. He didn't look up as she approached, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if he were trying to disappear into the cold, unforgiving concrete. Sarah stopped a few feet away, her presence marked only by the gentle rustle of her coat. She didn't want to startle him, to add to the weight he already carried. She waited, offering him the space he seemed to crave, the silence punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren and the relentless drumming of rain against the awning. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and gentle, a melody against the harsh symphony of the city. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her words carefully chosen, infused with a warmth that she hoped would penetrate his apparent despair. "Are you all right?" He didn't respond immediately. He remained motionless, his body a rigid statue of misery. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted his head. His eyes, dark and shadowed, met hers, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something else beneath the surface of his pain. A spark of resentment, perhaps, or even fear. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he mumbled something unintelligible, his voice barely a whisper lost in the wind. Sarah leaned closer, her concern growing. "I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you," she said, her voice still gentle, patient. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He shook his head, a sharp, almost violent movement that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. He looked away, his gaze drifting towards the bustling traffic, the indifferent faces of the people rushing past him. He seemed to shrink further into himself, as if wanting to become invisible, to cease to exist. Sarah felt a surge of empathy, a deep understanding of the loneliness and despair that radiated from him. She knew, instinctively, that he needed more than just a helping hand. He needed a connection, a spark of hope in the darkness that enveloped him. And so, she offered him what she had to offer, a prayer. "Would you like me to pray for you?" she asked, her voice a quiet offering of solace. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two souls, one seeking comfort, the other offering it freely. The answer, however, was far from what she expected. The question hung in the air, a simple offering of compassion in the face of profound despair. Sarah waited, her gaze soft, her heart filled with a quiet hope. She knew that prayer wasn't a magic solution, but it was a way to connect, to offer solace, to acknowledge the shared humanity that bound them together, despite the vast chasm of circumstance separating them. Mark didn't respond immediately. His silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of rain on the awning above them. He stared at the ground, his fingers twisting the frayed edges of his worn-out coat. The silence felt oppressive, a tangible barrier between them. Sarah wondered if she had overstepped, if her offer of prayer had been too intrusive, too presumptuous. Finally, Mark looked up, his eyes dark and wary. He didn't meet Sarah's gaze directly. Instead, his eyes darted around, scanning the street, as if searching for an escape route, a way to disappear into the anonymity of the city. His expression was a complex mixture of emotions: suspicion, resentment, and a deep, underlying weariness that seemed to weigh him down like a physical burden. "Prayer," he finally said, his voice rough and gravelly, like sandpaper scraping against stone. The word sounded foreign on his tongue, as if he hadn't heard it in years, perhaps decades. There was no warmth in his tone, no hint of acceptance or gratitude. Instead, it carried a note of skepticism, even hostility. Sarah didn't flinch. She understood his resistance. His life, judging by his appearance and demeanor, had been one of hardship and disappointment. He probably had little faith left in anything, let alone the power of prayer. But she also knew that beneath the hardened exterior, there was still a spark of humanity, a flicker of hope that could be rekindled with compassion and understanding. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "A prayer. Just a simple prayer for strength, for peace, for whatever burdens you're carrying." She paused, giving him time to process her words, to consider her offer. She didn't push, didn't pressure him. She simply waited, offering him the space to make his own choice. He remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the swirling vortex of rain and traffic. Sarah could feel the weight of his unspoken pain, the silent battle raging within him. She knew that he was fighting a war against himself, a war against despair, against the crushing weight of his circumstances. Then, he spoke again, his voice laced with bitterness and resentment. "I don't need your prayers," he said, his words sharp and edged with disdain. "I don't need your charity." He spat the word out like a curse, his eyes flashing with anger. He looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, shame, perhaps, or maybe just the raw, unfiltered pain of a life lived on the margins. Sarah felt a pang of sadness, but she didn't let it show. She had encountered this kind of resistance before, the hardened skepticism of those who had been hurt too many times, who had lost faith in the goodness of others. She knew that she couldn't force him to accept her offer, but she also knew that she couldn't give up on him. "I understand," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "but I still wanted to offer. Sometimes, even when we don't feel we need it, a little hope can make a difference." She paused, searching for the right words, the words that might bridge the gap between their worlds. Even a simple prayer can be a source of strength, a reminder that you're not alone. She offered a small, hopeful smile, a gesture of genuine compassion that transcended words. Mark didn't respond. His silence was heavier now, laden with a mix of anger, regret, and something else that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. He turned away, his shoulders slumping, his gaze fixed on the bleak, rain-swept street. The offer of prayer, so earnestly given, had been met with a wall of resistance, a fortress built from years of hardship and disappointment. Sarah knew that her work was far from over. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. Sarah waited, patient but not passive, her compassion unwavering despite the harsh rejection. She knew that Mark's anger wasn't directed solely at her. It was a manifestation of a deeper pain, a lifetime of accumulated hurts and disappointments. But the words that followed shattered the fragile hope she had held on to. Mark turned, his face contorted in a grimace of anger. His eyes, previously shadowed with despair, now burned with a hateful fire. The words that tumbled from his lips were a torrent of venom, a spew of bitterness and prejudice that left Sarah reeling. "Stay away from me, you," he stammered, searching for the right words to express his rage. His voice was thick with anger, his words slurred and distorted. He stumbled over his insults, his hatred barely contained. The words that finally escaped were laced with racial slurs, vile and hateful epithets that cut through Sarah like a knife. The shock of his outburst left Sarah momentarily speechless. She had braced herself for rejection, for indifference, even for hostility. But the sheer venom of his words, the blatant racism that poured from his lips, took her aback. She had expected anger, but not this raw, unfiltered hatred. For a moment, she stood frozen, the cold rain seeming to seep into her very bones. The warmth she had felt moments before, the compassion that had driven her to approach him, seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. The city noise faded into the background. The only sound the relentless drumming of rain and the ragged gasps of her own breath. She had dedicated her life to serving others, to spreading kindness and compassion. She had faced prejudice before, but never with such raw, unadulterated venom. The words stung, not just because of their hateful content, but because they were so unexpected, so jarring in their intensity. Sarah's initial shock slowly gave way to a quiet resolve. She wouldn't let his hatred extinguish the flame of compassion within her. She wouldn't allow his bitterness to poison her spirit. She had come to offer help, to extend a hand of friendship, and she wouldn't let his outburst deter her from her purpose. She took a deep breath, composing herself, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't stoop to his level, wouldn't respond with anger or hatred. Instead, she would meet his venom with quiet dignity, with unwavering compassion. "I understand you're hurting," she said, her voice calm and steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "But your pain doesn't give you the right to hurt others." Her words were measured, each syllable carefully chosen, a testament to her self-control. She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze unwavering, her compassion a silent challenge to his hatred. Mark's anger didn't subside. He continued his tirade, his words a torrent of abuse. He hurled insults, accusations, and more racial slurs, each one a testament to the depth of his bitterness and despair. He seemed to revel in his cruelty, his hatred feeding on his own pain. Sarah remained steadfast, her resolve unwavering. She knew that she couldn't change him in that moment, couldn't erase his years of accumulated pain. But she could offer him a different path, a path of compassion and understanding, even if he was unwilling to accept it at that moment. She stood there, a silent beacon of hope in the storm of his anger, a testament to the enduring power of compassion in the face of overwhelming hatred. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dirt and grime of the city, but it couldn't wash away the stain of Mark's hateful words. The encounter left a deep mark on Sarah's heart, a reminder of the darkness that still existed in the world, and the urgent need for compassion and understanding. The night was long and unforgiving, a mirror reflecting the turmoil within Mark. He found no solace in the meager shelter of the alleyway, where he usually slept. Instead, the darkness seemed to amplify the cacophony of emotions raging within him. The rain, which had fallen relentlessly throughout the day, had finally ceased, leaving behind a damp chill that seeped into his bones. But the cold was nothing compared to the icy grip of regret that tightened its hold on his heart. He replayed the encounter with Sarah in his mind, each hateful word echoing in the silence of the night. The memory of her calm demeanor, her unwavering compassion in the face of his outburst, was a stark contrast to the fury that had consumed him. He had been so consumed by his own anger, his own pain, that he hadn't seen her kindness, her genuine desire to help. He had lashed out at her, not just with anger, but with the most hateful words he could muster, words born of prejudice and fueled by a lifetime of bitterness. Shame gnawed at him, a relentless tide eroding the fragile foundations of his self-worth. He had been cruel, unjust, and utterly unforgivable. The woman, who had offered him nothing but kindness, had been met with a torrent of hatred, a display of the worst parts of himself. He had allowed his anger to define him, to dictate his actions, and the result was a profound sense of self-loathing. Sleep offered no escape. His mind raced, a relentless carousel of memories, regrets, and self-recriminations. He tossed and turned, his body aching, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The images of Sarah's face, her expression of quiet dignity, haunted him. He saw the hurt in her eyes, the unspoken disappointment, and it pierced him with a sharp pang of guilt. He tried to rationalize his behavior, to justify his outburst. He told himself that he was tired, hungry, and desperate. He told himself that he had been pushed to the edge, that his anger was a natural response to his circumstances. But none of these excuses could alleviate the crushing weight of his shame. The city noises, usually a dull background hum, now seemed to mock him, each sound a reminder of his isolation, his loneliness, and his own self-inflicted misery. The distant sirens, the occasional shouts from the street, the rumble of passing cars, all served as a constant reminder of his precarious existence, his vulnerability, and his utter failure to treat another human being with basic decency. He thought about Sarah's offer of prayer, an act of kindness that he had so brutally rejected. He had scoffed at her faith, her compassion, her willingness to offer help to a stranger. Now, he desperately wished he could take back his words, could undo the damage he had inflicted. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that he had turned away love when it had been freely given. As the night wore on, his anger began to subside, replaced by a gnawing emptiness, a void filled with regret and self-loathing. He knew he couldn't erase what he had done, couldn't undo the hurt he had caused, but he could try to make amends, to find a way to atone for his actions. The thought of seeking Sarah out, of apologizing for his behavior, began to take root in his mind, a fragile seed of hope in the barren landscape of his despair. The night, which had begun with anger and bitterness, ended with a glimmer of remorse, a faint stirring of conscience in the depths of his troubled soul. The dawn brought with it not relief, but a new kind of torment, the torment of guilt and the agonizing realization of his own failings. The sliver of dawn offered no respite. Instead, it ushered in a new kind of torment. Mark drifted into a troubled sleep, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous day. His dreams, usually a jumbled mess of fragmented images and half-remembered experiences, were tonight different, vivid, and terrifyingly real. He found himself in a vast, desolate landscape, a barren wasteland stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with an oppressive silence that pressed down on him, suffocating him. There was no sun, no stars, only a perpetual twilight that cast long, distorted shadows. He felt alone, utterly and completely alone, adrift in a sea of emptiness. Then he saw it, a figure looming large against the desolate sky. It was impossibly tall, its form shrouded in darkness, its features indistinct, yet somehow terrifyingly familiar. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence radiated an overwhelming sense of power, of judgment. It seemed to emanate a chilling aura, a palpable weight that pressed down on Mark, crushing him beneath its immense authority. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped him. He tried to run, to escape the oppressive presence, but his legs felt heavy, unresponsive. He was trapped, immobilized by a terror that went beyond the physical, a fear that burrowed deep into his soul. The figure remained motionless, its silence more terrifying than any scream. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand, a skeletal finger pointing directly at Mark. The gesture was not accusatory, not angry, but rather a profound expression of sorrow, of disappointment. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the desolate landscape. It wasn't a shout or a whisper, but a voice that seemed to resonate from within Mark himself, a voice that echoed the deepest recesses of his conscience. "You turned away love when it was freely given." The voice boomed, its words carrying the weight of centuries, the accumulated wisdom of ages. The words struck Mark with the force of a physical blow. He understood, with a sickening clarity, the true meaning of his actions. He hadn't just rejected Sarah's offer of prayer. He had rejected an act of pure, selfless kindness. He had turned his back on compassion, on empathy, on the very essence of human connection. And in doing so, he had condemned himself to this desolate wasteland of his own making. The figure's hand remained raised, the skeletal finger still pointing at him. Mark felt a surge of despair, a crushing weight of regret. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. He was paralyzed by shame, by the crushing weight of his own guilt. The dream intensified, the landscape growing darker, the figure looming larger. The voice echoed again, its words a relentless condemnation of his actions, a stark reminder of the harm he had inflicted. He felt a profound sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in his despair. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the dream ended. Mark awoke with a gasp, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. The darkness of the dream clung to him, a chilling reminder of the consequences of his actions. The words, "You turned away love when it was freely given," echoed in his mind, a haunting condemnation that pierced his soul. The weight of his guilt was almost unbearable, a crushing burden that left him feeling utterly desolate and alone. The dream, though terrifying, had served its purpose. It had awakened his conscience, forcing him to confront the true nature of his actions and the devastating consequences of his hateful rejection. The dawn, which had previously brought only despair, now held a glimmer of something else, a desperate hope for redemption. The lingering chill of the pre-dawn air did little to soothe the turmoil within Mark. He awoke not to the gentle easing of sleep, but to a jarring, abrupt awakening, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The vivid horror of his dream clung to him, a suffocating blanket of guilt and regret. The desolate landscape, the looming figure, the condemning voice, all were etched into his memory, a stark and terrifying reminder of his actions toward Sarah. The words, "You turned away love when it was freely given," reverberated in his mind, a relentless echo of his own failure. He hadn't just been unkind. He had been cruel, hateful, and utterly unforgivable. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate him. He sat up, his body stiff and aching, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of self-recrimination. He ran a hand through his tangled hair, his fingers catching on the stubble of his beard. He felt dirty, not just physically, but spiritually, tainted by the venom of his own words. The memory of Sarah's face, her expression of quiet dignity in the face of his outburst, was a searing brand on his conscience. He had seen the hurt in her eyes, the unspoken disappointment, and it pierced him with a fresh wave of guilt. He had not only insulted her, but he had also rejected her compassion, her willingness to offer help to a stranger in need. He had spent his life hardening himself against the world, building walls of bitterness and resentment to protect himself from further pain. But in doing so, he had also shut out kindness, compassion, and the possibility of human connection. Sarah's offer of prayer had been a lifeline, a chance to break free from the cycle of negativity that had defined his existence. And he had thrown it back in her face. The rationalizations he had concocted during the night, the justifications he had offered for his behavior, crumbled under the weight of his guilt. He couldn't blame his anger on hunger, fatigue, or his difficult circumstances. His cruelty had been a conscious choice, a deliberate rejection of kindness, and the consequences were now weighing heavily on his soul. He looked around at his surroundings, the bleak alleyway, the damp concrete, the overflowing trash cans. The ugliness of his environment seemed to mirror the ugliness within him. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a deep loneliness that went beyond his physical circumstances. He was alone not just in the alleyway, but in his own heart, separated from himself by a wall of self-loathing and regret. The thought of Sarah, her unwavering compassion in the face of his hatred, filled him with a sense of profound shame. He had been so consumed by his own pain, his own bitterness, that he hadn't been able to see her kindness. He had allowed his anger to blind him, to distort his perception of reality. And now, he was left with the bitter taste of his own cruelty, the agonizing realization of what he had done. The dream, though terrifying, had served as a catalyst, a brutal awakening that had shattered the defenses he had so painstakingly constructed. The guilt was overwhelming, a heavy cloak of remorse that stifled his breath. But within the depths of his despair, a flicker of hope began to ignite. A desperate desire to make amends, to seek forgiveness, to somehow undo the damage he had inflicted began to take hold. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could try to change the future. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed of redemption, taking root in the fertile ground of his remorse. The gnawing guilt proved a more potent motivator than hunger or fatigue. Mark, usually content to drift through his days in a haze of apathy, found himself driven by a newfound urgency. The memory of Sarah's face, her quiet dignity in the face of his outburst, spurred him into action. He had to find her, to apologize, to somehow atone for his hateful behavior. He knew it was a long shot. He hadn't even known her name, only that she had approached him with an offer of prayer, an act of kindness he had brutally rejected. He had no way of knowing where she lived, where she worked, or even if she would want to see him again after his venomous outburst. But the need to make amends was overwhelming, a force stronger than his usual inertia. He had to try. He had to atone for his cruelty, to show her, and perhaps more importantly, himself, that he was capable of remorse, of change. He started by retracing his steps from the previous day, walking slowly, methodically, scanning the streets, searching for any familiar landmark, any clue that might lead him to Sarah. He revisited the spot where they had met, the crumbling brick awning beneath which he had huddled, his heart heavy with the weight of his past actions. The street seemed different now, devoid of the usual indifference. Every face he saw seemed to carry a judgment, a condemnation of his behavior. He spoke to several people, describing Sarah, hoping someone might recognize her. He showed them a crude sketch he'd made in the dirt with a stick, a pathetic attempt to capture her kind face. Most people dismissed him, their eyes conveying a mixture of suspicion and pity. Some simply ignored him, their faces averted, their bodies turning away as if to avoid contamination. He felt the sting of rejection, the familiar pang of isolation. But the guilt, the overwhelming need to make amends, kept him going. He couldn't give up. He had to find her, even if it was the last thing he ever did. Hours passed, the city streets blurring into a monotonous landscape of indifference. His hope began to dwindle, replaced by a growing sense of despair. He was losing faith, not in God, but in the possibility of redemption, in the chance of ever making things right. The weight of his past actions felt almost unbearable, a crushing burden that threatened to crush him. But then a flicker of hope. A woman, walking her dog, stopped and looked at him. She studied his worn-out clothes, his weary face, his desperate eyes. She had seen him before, she said, near the soup kitchen. She remembered a woman, a kind-faced woman, who had approached him there. She didn't know her name, but she remembered seeing her often in the neighborhood, volunteering at the church. Mark's heart leaped. The soup kitchen. The church. He had a lead, a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. He thanked the woman profusely, his voice thick with emotion. He felt a surge of energy, a renewed determination. He had a direction, a path to follow. The search had been arduous, filled with rejection and despair, but it had also revealed something within him, a capacity for remorse, a willingness to atone, a desperate hope for redemption. His journey to find Sarah was also a journey of self-discovery, a painful but necessary process of confronting his past and embracing the possibility of a different future. Armed with the woman's information, Mark headed towards the church, his heart pounding a rhythm of hope and trepidation. The church, a small, unassuming building nestled in a quiet residential neighborhood, seemed to radiate an aura of peace, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the city streets. He hesitated at the entrance, his hand hovering over the worn brass handle. He felt a surge of self-doubt, a wave of apprehension that threatened to overwhelm him. What if Sarah wasn't there? What if she refused to see him? What if she didn't even remember him? He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had come too far to turn back now. He owed it to Sarah, and more importantly, to himself, to see this through. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The church was quiet, serene, filled with the scent of old wood and incense. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the polished wooden floor. The air was thick with a sense of peace, a tranquility that seemed to soothe his frayed nerves. He spotted Sarah almost immediately. She was sitting in a pew near the back, her head bowed in prayer. Her posture was one of quiet devotion, her hands clasped together, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, serene, utterly unaware of his presence. He watched her for a moment, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and admiration. He had treated her with such cruelty, such hatred, and yet she seemed to radiate an aura of unwavering compassion. He felt a pang of shame, a deep sense of regret for the pain he had inflicted. He approached her cautiously, his steps hesitant, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to startle her, to disrupt her moment of peace. He stood beside her for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, he cleared his throat, a nervous sound that broke the silence of the church. Sarah opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. Her expression was one of surprise, a mixture of astonishment and confusion. She didn't seem angry, not exactly, but there was a flicker of wariness in her eyes, a hint of apprehension. "Mark," she said, her voice soft, questioning. She didn't seem to recognize him at first, her eyes scanning his disheveled appearance, his weary face, his clothes stained and torn. The transformation from the man who had stood before her on the street was striking. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. He felt a lump forming in his throat, his eyes welling up. He had come to apologize, to seek forgiveness, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, choked by emotion. Sarah's surprise gave way to a look of recognition. Her eyes widened slightly, her expression softening. She seemed to remember him, to recall the encounter from the previous day. But there was no anger in her eyes, no trace of resentment. Only a quiet concern, a gentle compassion that seemed to pierce through his defenses. The moment hung heavy with unspoken emotions, a silent acknowledgement of the events that had brought them together again, under such different circumstances. The weight of his past actions pressed down on Mark, but the look in Sarah's eyes offered a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise of forgiveness. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Mark struggled to find the words, his throat tight with a mixture of shame and remorse. He had come to apologize, to seek forgiveness, but the words seemed to elude him, trapped in the confines of his guilt. He looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a quiet compassion that both surprised and humbled him. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even disgust. Instead, he found understanding, a willingness to listen, a capacity for forgiveness that he hadn't anticipated. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I came to apologize," he stammered, his words halting, his voice choked with emotion. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. He had been cruel, hateful, and utterly unforgivable. And yet, Sarah's quiet presence, her unwavering compassion, offered him a glimmer of hope. He continued, his voice gaining strength, his words flowing more freely. "I'm so sorry for what I said to you," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "I was wrong. I was out of line. I behaved terribly." He paused, taking a deep breath, steeling himself to confront the full extent of his actions. "I was angry," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I was hurt. I was bitter. But that doesn't excuse my behavior. There's no justification for what I said. My words were hateful, prejudiced, and completely unacceptable. I have no excuse." He paused again, his eyes welling up. He felt a wave of self-loathing, a deep sense of regret for the pain he had inflicted. He looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze. Her expression was one of quiet understanding, her eyes conveying a depth of compassion that surprised and humbled him. He saw no judgment, no condemnation, only a gentle empathy that touched his soul. "I know I can't take back what I said," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't erase the hurt I caused, but I want you to know how truly sorry I am. I was wrong, and I deeply regret my actions." He paused, searching for the right words to express the depth of his remorse. I didn't see your kindness," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was so consumed by my own pain, my own bitterness, that I couldn't see your compassion. Your offer of prayer, it was an act of pure kindness. and I rejected it with hatred. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Tears streamed down his face, tears of shame, of regret, of profound self-loathing. He looked at Sarah, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had bared his soul, confessed his failings, and now he waited, with bated breath, for her response. The weight of his apology hung heavy in the air, a silent plea for forgiveness, a desperate hope for redemption. The simple act of apologizing, of acknowledging his wrongdoing, was a monumental step for Mark, a testament to the transformative power of remorse and the fragile hope for a new beginning. Sarah listened patiently, her gaze unwavering, her expression one of quiet compassion. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply listened, allowing Mark to pour out his heart, to confess his failings, to acknowledge the depth of his remorse. When he had finished speaking, when the torrent of his confession had finally subsided, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light, yet it carried a profound weight, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, his suffering, his genuine remorse. It was a gesture of empathy, of understanding, of unwavering compassion. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, a sense of release from the crushing burden of his guilt. "Mark," she said, her voice soft, gentle, filled with a warmth that reached deep into his soul. "I forgive you." The words were simple, yet they carried immense weight, a profound expression of grace and understanding. They weren't a dismissal of his actions, nor a condoning of his hateful words. They were an acknowledgement of his remorse, a recognition of his genuine desire for change. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. He had expected anger, rejection, perhaps even disgust. Instead, he found forgiveness, a gift offered freely, without judgment or reservation. The weight of his guilt began to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He couldn't find the words to express his gratitude, his relief, his profound sense of awe at her capacity for compassion. He had expected condemnation, yet he had received grace. Sarah smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that eased his pain. "Your apology was sincere, Mark," she said, her voice soft, reassuring. "And that's what matters. We all make mistakes, and we all deserve a second chance." She paused, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "But forgiveness isn't just about letting go of the past," she continued. "It's also about learning from our mistakes, about growing from our experiences, about becoming better people." She reached in her bag and produced a small, worn prayer book. She opened it to a particular page, her finger resting on a passage. "Would you like me to pray for you now, Mark?" she asked, her voice a gentle invitation. The words were the same words she had offered him on the street, the same words he had so brutally rejected. But this time the context was different. This time, her offer was not an act of charity, but an act of faith, a testament to her unwavering belief in the power of redemption. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with tears. He had rejected her prayer before, fueled by anger and prejudice. Now, humbled by his own failings, he accepted her offer with a grateful heart. He closed his eyes, allowing her words to wash over him, a balm to his wounded soul. Sarah's prayer was a simple one, a plea for strength, for peace, for healing. But for Mark, it was a lifeline, a source of comfort, a beacon of hope in the darkness of his despair. As Sarah prayed, Mark felt a profound sense of peace wash over him, a release from the burden of his guilt. He knew he still had a long way to go, but with Sarah's forgiveness and her prayer, he felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief in the possibility of redemption, a chance to start anew. The prayer ended, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Mark remained seated, his eyes closed, his body relaxed, a sense of peace washing over him. The weight of his guilt, which had been a constant companion for so long, seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. He felt lighter, cleansed, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Sarah's forgiveness, her unwavering compassion, had touched something deep within him, awakening a dormant capacity for self-reflection and change. He opened his eyes, meeting Sarah's gaze. Her eyes held a quiet understanding, a gentle affirmation of his transformation. He saw no judgment, no condemnation, only a profound empathy that touched his soul. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't find the words to express the depth of his gratitude, the profound impact of her kindness. He had come seeking forgiveness, and he had received it freely and unconditionally. But more than forgiveness, he had received something far more valuable, a renewed sense of hope, a belief in the possibility of redemption. He spent the next few hours talking with Sarah, sharing his story, his struggles, his regrets. He spoke of his difficult childhood, his years of hardship and disappointment, the bitterness that had hardened his heart. He spoke of the prejudice he had faced, the injustices he had endured, the anger that had consumed him. He confessed his hatred, his prejudice, his own failings. He laid bare his soul, revealing the depths of his pain, his vulnerability, his desperate need for change. Sarah listened patiently, offering words of encouragement, understanding, and support. She didn't offer easy answers or simplistic solutions. She simply listened, offering a safe space for him to process his emotions, to confront his past, to acknowledge his mistakes. Her presence was a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of compassion. As he spoke, Mark began to see his own life with new eyes. He saw the patterns of negativity, the self-destructive behaviors, the choices that had led him to this point. He recognized the ways in which his anger and bitterness had blinded him, had prevented him from seeing the kindness and compassion that had been offered to him. He saw the ways in which his prejudice had distorted his perception of reality, had prevented him from forming meaningful connections with others. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, nor was it effortless. It was a gradual process, a slow awakening, a painful but necessary journey of self-discovery. But with each passing moment, Mark felt a growing sense of peace, a quiet confidence that he could change, that he could overcome his past, that he could become a better person. He left the church feeling lighter, cleansed, renewed. The weight of his guilt had been lifted, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that his journey of self-improvement would be long and arduous. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had Sarah's support, her friendship, her unwavering belief in his capacity for change. And more importantly, he had found something within himself, a capacity for self-reflection, a willingness to confront his past, a determination to build a better future. The encounter with Sarah had been a turning point, a moment of profound transformation, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the possibility of redemption. The days that followed were a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness and faith. Mark, inspired by Sarah's unwavering kindness and the profound impact of her prayer, embarked on a journey of self-improvement, a determined effort to rebuild his life. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift, but a gradual process, a series of small steps that, taken together, marked a profound change. He started by accepting help from the soup kitchen, something he had previously rejected with disdain. He ate regular meals, a simple act that provided both physical and emotional sustenance. The regular routine, the sense of community, the shared meals, offered a sense of belonging he had long lacked. He began to engage with the volunteers, listening to their stories, sharing his own, slowly building connections with others. He sought out counseling, confronting his past traumas, his anger, his prejudice. He worked through the layers of bitterness and resentment that had hardened his heart, acknowledging the pain he had inflicted on others and the pain he had inflicted on himself. The process was difficult, painful, at times overwhelming. But with each session, he felt a growing sense of self-awareness, a deeper understanding of his own actions, and a growing capacity for empathy. He started attending church regularly, finding solace and strength in prayer and fellowship. He wasn't necessarily a believer in the traditional sense, but he found comfort in the community, the sense of belonging, the shared experience of faith. He participated in community service, volunteering at the soup kitchen, helping others in need. It was a way of giving back, of atoning for his past actions, of expressing his gratitude for Sarah's kindness. He began to read, expanding his knowledge, challenging his preconceived notions, broadening his perspective. He learned about different cultures, different religions, different ways of life. He confronted his own biases, his own prejudices, and began to see the world with new eyes. He started to understand the interconnectedness of humanity, the shared experiences that bound people together, regardless of race, religion, or background. He found a job, a simple, unskilled job, but a job nonetheless. It was a source of pride, a sense of accomplishment, a step towards self-sufficiency. He saved his money, planning for a better future, a future free from the despair and hopelessness that had defined his past. His relationship with Sarah deepened, evolving from a chance encounter to a genuine friendship. They met regularly, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their hopes for the future. She became a mentor, a confidant, a source of unwavering support and encouragement. Her faith, her compassion, her unwavering belief in his capacity for change inspired him to keep moving forward, to keep striving for a better life. Mark's transformation wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift. It was a gradual process, a slow but steady evolution. But the change was undeniable. He had emerged from the depths of despair, transformed by the power of forgiveness, faith, and the unwavering kindness of a stranger. His journey was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for change, and the enduring power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. He had found a new beginning, a path toward a life filled with hope, purpose, and genuine connection. His past remained a part of him, a reminder of the mistakes he had made, but it no longer defined him. He had found a new identity, a new purpose, a new life.